Hey, y'all, Joffrey the Giant, and I am going to talk today about chronological snobbery in anthropology and history. So, chronological snobbery is a phrase that many of you will be familiar with, but many may not be. I believe it was coined by C.S. Lewis. And it's a phrase that's used to express the idea that we have a tendency to think of our own time as being better and best, particularly if we are deluded into believing the myth of progress. Even people who are too wise and canny to just straight up admit that they believe in the myth of progress, in its Darwinian expressions particularly, still use language as if they do, because it's just in the water. And the way what I ran into recently that has me thinking of these things is an article from the Wall Street Journal. Recently came out in their science section. Vast Maya kingdom is revealed in Guatemalan jungle. Archaeologists identify a sprawling network of ancient ruins using laser mapping technology. And a very interesting article. But in the article, one Dr. Hansen, says that the ruins tell a story of the rise and precocious development of an incredibly organized, sophisticated society. Okay. Well, there's a word I read over there relatively quickly, precocious. That really piqued my interest. It turns out that archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians of the transition from prehistory into history in various contexts use the term precocious all the time. Such a Darwinian word in these contexts. So, what does precocious actually mean? So, according to Merriam-Webster, precocious means exceptionally early in development or occurrence, as in precocious puberty, exhibiting mature qualities at an unusually early age, a precocious child. Of course, with both those examples, that's the context that we're used to seeing precocious used in. And like all Merriam-Webster listings, it gives a bunch of example sentences. Recent examples on the web all have to do with kids. Okay? So Jackson's mom, Brittany Reed, said her precocious son was Chucky for Halloween, blah, blah, blah. All the examples recently from the web are about people's precocious children. But in the example sentences chosen by Merriam-Webster themselves, most of them are about children, but the very first one from a Newsweek article, July 2002, but what has paleontologists agog is this Google granddaddy's precocious attributes, most notably the relative flatness of its face, which is more modern looking than skulls half its age. If you Google things like precocious civilization, precocious Mayan, etc., then you will find this sort of use being very prevalent. And the quote that I just read to you, well, there is this idea that inevitably the progression will be toward what we are today, and that man was going to mature into us. Now, what's pernicious about that idea, besides buying into the Darwinian worldview, is that it suggests that this Google granddaddy with a flat face was not complete, was not yet done, was not mature. It also suggests that we may not be done, may not be mature. And that's problematic because it creates an ontological crisis for us. It makes it difficult for us to conceive of ourselves as being what we ought to be. It also creates this chronological snobbery, this idea that we are better than people were 100 years ago, and we're way better than people were 2, 3, or 4,000 years ago. This leads to all sorts of blindnesses and myopia. Things that get hinted at. Well, for example, we'll say, okay, well, yeah, we don't know how to make Greek fire. We'll discover it one day. Was it napalm? We don't know. We don't know everything that they knew. But the thing is that we tend to look at ancient civilizations and the things they did through the lens of what we are able to do. And so we struggle when we see the great works of the ancients to come up with answers. Like, how did they cut these stones? How did they make and we actually don't even allow ourselves to entertain certain possibilities, which creates conspiracies, right? I mean, ancient aliens is a response to this, and at the same time, the ultimate incarnation of this idea, right? That these people were not developed enough to do these things on their own. It must have been aliens, right? But even in the non-conspiratorial, non-weird alien things, it cuts off academia from, well, taking things at face value, or it encourages them to make the size of face value very, very, very small. So that, for example, if someone wants to suggest that Egyptians had figured out how to power drills somehow, we can't entertain that at all. And in fact, we must be misreading these things. The one thing we can't accept is that Egyptians figured out how to power drills, or figured out how to plane things in some sort of automatized fashion. Because we're stuck in our timeline and the way we look at things. There's a book, a science fiction book. I'm about to go ahead and get fantastic now. West of Eden. It makes me think of this, because so West of Eden. This is what I'm going to use to bolster my argument. Okay, a book about dinosaurs and people together. Okay, but I read this thing as a teenager, and it really made me think about a lot of things in this book. Was the author's name Harrison? Let me look this up really quickly. But in this book, there's this idea. So there are two different civilizations, West of Eden. Harry Harrison. That's the stainless steel rat guy. So the dinosaurs use biotech, like really in-depth biotechnology, not our kind of biotechnology that we use, iron tech to develop, right? Like straight from this started with breeding, crossbreeding, into now we can actually make microscopes. Microscopes are animals, and we look through their eyes, and this is all they are. They exist. They're machines. They're animals that are machines. And then the humans, who are quite primitive, use tools made of wood and stone. Okay. But if we think about that and how we view history, then when we think, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If we think the solutions all look a certain way, right? If we think the solutions are all our solutions, it blinds us. It took us forever to figure out why Roman concrete was so dang good. And if you read the debates about this stuff, it is amazing how much unwillingness to consider this is a real question was even out there, because we are so thoroughly bought into this idea that history progresses along a narrow line and that we are at the peak of history and of civilization simply by virtue of still being alive, right? So precocious Mayans. They talked to the gods. They enslaved their enemies and sacrificed them to the gods. They made their calendars. They built their temples. There's so much about that field that should only reinforce our feelings of ignorance and not make us use words like precocious. In that story, one of the scientists talked about how he knows that he walked past enormous ruins only feet from them and didn't find them. But then this mapping, this sky mapping, is enabling them to find things. But, and of course these historians know this, but civilizations rose and fell within those jungles. And it's just weird to use a word like precocious. And yet they do, because they have so thoroughly drunk from modern waters, right? I mean, the fact is that there are civilizations that rose in the jungles of Central America and likely South America that have disappeared or left very little vestige. And then there was nothing. And then something else emerged. We're talking about centuries and centuries. And these things aren't as easy to discover in that terrain. So that you can actually walk past some mighty temple and not see it. And there's plenty of scholarship on this, on the fact, there are some temples, there are temples that can still be accessed by tourists. Like there's one I'm thinking of now, I can't remember the name, but it's on a bit of an island. And if you're going to visit it, you have to, it's south of Mexico, maybe in Costa Rica. I don't know exactly where this is, Panama possibly, well, south of Mexico. You have to get in a boat for like 3 or 4 days to get there. And the indigenous people who are there describe the creators of this temple as their ancestors. Except they're not really. We're talking about a civilization that rose and fell centuries and centuries ago. We don't even know their names. Are the people who still live there their descendants? Very, very possibly. But great civilization came and great civilization went. By the time the Europeans arrived, we're talking about a subsistence level tribe. And this is where I know I'm sort of wandering now, but I think reading science fiction and fantasy can be really illuminating for this sort of thing, right? Or post-apocalyptic literature is so popular. You think about, well, what would the first generation be like after the collapse of civilization, or the one after that? Well, what about 10 generations after that, right? You'd still be living in these ruins. I think that sort of thing can be really helpful, because that is what has happened in the past and may happen again, right? And it's not for nothing that Mel Gibson called his great Mesoamerican film Apocalypto. And we read things casually and to the side that we just sort of dismiss, like, well, the northeast of the United States in pre-colonial times had fewer trees than it did in colonial times. Why? Because the native peoples, who traded and communicated far broadly than you likely think, tended and stewarded the forests for the purposes of improved hunting. when the colonists didn't need to subsist off of hunting in those forests, the forest actually went to seed, as it were, became more primitive jungle, right? The British actually used the term jungle to talk about the forest on the East Coast, further south at least, when they were interacting with the Cherokees. We see the civilizations in the Midwest. I forget the name of the one great city, but there are remnants all over of Mississippian civilizations, right? Things rise and fall. People come and go, and none of it is precocious. None of it is precocious. All of it is just human. Now, I know that when people say there's a precocious civilization, they're not trying to say they were subhuman. I'm just saying that our means of understanding human society, human civilizations, human history, it can definitely appeal to the bigger things. It should appeal to the eternal things, right? Moral judgments are what should be made in moral humility, of course. What's the name of the Greek explorer? Is it Pindar, the great Greek explorer who perhaps went very far north? Oh, it's not Pindar. No, that's a Greek poet. Greek explorer. Pythias. Did he ever visit Iceland? Maybe. Certainly worth talking about. Did he get to know the Celts, particularly the British Celts, very well? It seems almost certain. Look him up. Fascinating figure. But if he was interacting with, so he took astronomical measurements as he traveled. This is how we know how far north he got, or claims to have gotten at various stages. And if he spent time in the far north of Scotland, which many believe he did, then he saw henges that interact with the stars and inform us about the stars that were older to him than he is to us. Who knows what was in Europe before the Celts? And when the Celts arrived, how many Celtic civilizations may have risen and fallen? And why do we know so little? Well, maybe because their civilizations were based on things other than what ours are based on. We are people of concrete and steel. And our civilizational ancestors were people of concrete and steel. We should not underestimate the degree to which we are children of the Romans. There are a lot of different ways of being human, and we should be excited about discovering many of those ancient ways and be excited about moving forward into new ways. And all, of course, pointing to Jesus Christ and to his kingdom. But none of it precocious. All of it to be measured on the standard of what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. All right, the peace of Christ be upon you.
What day is it today? Remind me.
It's Sunday, Mr. Pension.
Sunday. And what do we do on a Sunday morning, wherever we happen to be? We go to church, you bloody heathen!